Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. This is a subject that the Planning and Zoning Commission has been working on over the course of almost the last 10 months or so, discussing the concepts of local food production and how the city zoning code addresses that currently today. That work ultimately has led us to consideration of a proposed amendment to the zoning code this evening. Just to give a little overview, what we'll talk about a little bit is what is urban agriculture when we're using the term. Some of the reasons why the city or the Planning and Zoning Commission feels the city should support urban agricultural activities. We'll look a little bit at how the city's current zoning code addresses these kinds of land uses and activities, some of the common scales of these activities that we saw through the course of our research, some of the common components consideration, and then we'll talk a little bit about the discussion of what's being proposed this evening. When we start off the discussion of urban ag, because it can be a fairly broad topic, it's generally the practice of cultivating, processing, and distributing food in or around a village, town, or city. It can also involve animal husbandry, aquaculture, agroforestry, and horticultural type uses, but predominantly we're going to be talking about the cultivating and processing of food crops within the city. As the Planning and Zoning Commission examined the topic and looked at the reasons why they should support urban agriculture within the community, certainly first and foremost it's to promote local food production that helps promote food independence and security within the community. It increases access to affordable, healthy foods, and it provides productive and functional open spaces within the community. It allows an opportunity for economic development and vitality, and oftentimes it's a productive use of underutilized lands that are not appropriate for transition to a different land use or more intense land use at this time due to a lack of infrastructure, utilities, or other services, and it can provide a productive use of those lands in the intervening time. Currently, Moscow City Code does not address urban agriculture very well. We have a traditional exclusionary zoning code where if a use is not named, it's generally considered to be not permitted within that zoning district. We do have some legal non-conforming pre-existing agricultural uses within the community, but when we look at the list of permitted uses within the zoning code, they really are only addressed within the ag, forest, farm, ranch, and only slightly within the suburban residential district. Among the city's other 9 zoning districts, it is silent, and so generally would be considered not to be a legally permissible use in those districts. The end result is that those types of agricultural uses are generally not explicitly permitted within about 91% of the land area of the city, and thus the Commission's recommendation to pass the amendment this evening. There is some recognition of fowl and livestock within the police regulations, but that is not reflected within the zoning code, which does create a little bit of an internal conflict within the city's code as well. Over the course of this project, we reviewed several urban ag ordinances from cities within the state of Idaho and surrounding states. We looked at Boise, Idaho, Haley, Idaho, Portland, Oregon, Wheat Ridge, Colorado, and Seattle, Washington. And the Commission also reviewed a publication from the American Planning Association published in 2010 dealing with the issue. There's a compilation of the research that was in your packet that is for your review this evening. As we looked at the urban ag activities, we saw fairly standard common scales of these activities, from your traditional backyard garden to larger community gardens to even larger potential market gardens, and then finally for the distribution in farmers markets. And a variety of communities address these all in a different manner, different fashion, but these were common scales of these activities that we utilized as we examined the topic. Many of the common components obviously include the growing and harvesting of crops, potentially the raising of fowl or for meat or eggs, possible on-site food distribution for community-supported agriculture, possible on-site retail sales. This could also include just the raw crops or potentially value-added items like jellies or jams or other items from produce that were grown on site. Traditionally, as we looked at other districts and where other communities in our research where they're permitted, often most communities address these as being permitted uses within all zoning districts within their cities. There may have been some requirements depending upon the scale of the use. There may have been specific use standards, administrative approvals, or conditional use permits that were required. And many of the common considerations that other communities had addressed in their look at this use, obviously we're looking at scale of operations, and again looking at the market or the community gardens into the farmers markets, what types of accessory structures are allowed in association with that use, potentially the hours of operations, whether off-street parking was required, or more often than not likely restricted in a desire to not change the character of a residential neighborhood. How signage was addressed, use of machinery, and on-site customer service were oftentimes things that were addressed. And finally, just general nuisance provisions maybe related to the management of compost or manure if there are animals involved, general drainage, and other considerations. As we began the process, as I mentioned, the Commission began the discussion in November of last year. During December into January, the Commission researched and reviewed the different ordinances and publications in the process, and began in January of this year conducting listening sessions to solicit input from existing urban ag operators in and around the community. They continued the review in February this year to review the input they received from the listening session and direct staff to prepare a draft for further review, and then conducted a second review on February 27th and decided to conduct a separate second input session on March 27th, which again the Commission conducted on that date. On April 10th, the Commission approved final changes in response to some final comments it received in the March listening session and directed that it proceed to consideration during a public hearing, which was conducted by the Planning and Zoning Commission on June 12th of this year, at which time they recommended approval of the ordinance with one minor modification for the Council's consideration this evening. As we look at the proposed ordinance, there are several components to it, the first of which is to introduce the definitions of use, so that we can insert the use terms within the various zoning districts. There were three uses that the Commission felt should be defined: accessory gardens, community gardens, and market gardens. So essentially we'd establish, the ordinance before you would establish definitions for those uses. Accessory gardens would be a permitted use within all zoning districts, and community and market gardens would be permitted uses within all districts as well. There would be specific use standards under the proposal for community and market gardens that would occur within the suburban residential, that should be SR, R1, R2, R3, and R4 zoning districts. And the ordinance also establishes the keeping of animals and fowl as accessory uses as provided for within Title 10 of the City Code, and that is the police regulations and the animal regulations for the city. As we look at the definitions, the accessory garden definition is the use of land for growing of produce and or plants that is accessory to a permitted principal use and where the produce from the garden is primarily grown for the consumption, use, or donation by persons residing or employed upon the subject property. Accessory gardens may include the keeping of animals and fowls permitted by this code. On-site retail sales are not permitted in association with accessory gardens unless specifically permitted under this code. As we looked at community gardens, it is defined as a collective use of land for the growing of produce and or plants conducted by a group of people where the site is commonly divided into plots that individuals may rent for the season, where the produce or plant materials grown upon the site are intended for consumption, use, or donation by the persons cultivating the land. On-site retail sales are generally not permitted in association with community gardens unless specifically permitted under this code. And finally, the market garden definition, fairly similar, the use of land for the growing of produce and or plants that are conducted by a single individual or group of individuals where the produce or plant materials grown upon the site are intended to be sold for consumption by others. Market gardens may include the keeping of animals and fowls permitted by this code. On-site retail sales are not permitted in association with market gardens unless specifically permitted under this code. As we looked at the different zoning districts, as I mentioned, accessory gardens would be permitted within all zoning districts within the city. The market and community gardens would be permitted principal use within all zoning districts, with the exception of the research, technology, and office district, where only accessory gardens would be permitted. Retail activities associated with market or community gardens would be permitted with the ag, forest, and farm ranch, and all commercial districts, and conditionally permitted within all other districts. And those are all predominantly the lower intensity residential districts where similar types of activities like accessory home occupations that have any on-site customer service or any employees that are working out of the home-based business also require a conditional use permit, and the Commission felt that those uses should be treated equally. And finally, as I mentioned, the keeping of animals and fowls as allowed under Title 10 would be permitted as a principal use within the ag, forest, and farm ranch districts and as a permitted accessory use within all other residential zoning districts. Finally, as we looked at the specific...
Can I ask Bill a quick question?
Sure.
Going through this, it looks like most of this is dealing with produce.
Correct.
So we're not changing anything as far as animal uses. That's already taken care of in Chapter 10.
Correct. There are no changes to the animal regulations that are being proposed.
Just wanted to make sure.
We're only providing a cross-reference to that section of the code within the zoning code.
And with that, Bill, would you back up to that last slide, please?
Yeah, that's right, the last one, yeah. Just want to make sure that the public was aware that we weren't changing anything as far as animals. It's dealing with
Correct.
produce.
Correct. It's only making a cross-reference and connection between the two sections, two chapters of the city code.
Okay, I guess that just answered my question, because it talked about animals in this code, and then I saw all the cross-outs of the animals. So when you say this code, you mean the entire city code in
The
the
global
chapter 10?
code. Correct. Correct.
Okay, great, thanks.
As we looked at the final section that are the specific use standards, there are some fairly general standards that, the first of which that are permitted accessory structures, and these would only apply, again, to those activities that are within the SR, R1, R2, and R3 and R4 zoning districts. If you're in the ag forest or the farm ranch, these would not be applied to you, or if you're in a commercial district, they would not apply. Under item number 1, permitted accessory structures, hoop houses, greenhouses, sheds, and other minor accessory structures without permanent foundations and of less than 1,000 square feet in size shall be permitted in association with the operation of a permitted market or community garden use. If the associated market or community garden use ceases, such structures shall be removed from the property. This was a discussion that we had, the fact that currently right now in a residential district, we generally don't allow accessory structures to be constructed until there's a principal use that can be accessory to. With a agricultural activity, the principal use obviously would be the cultivating the crops, and these accessory structures are necessary to support that activity, so we wanted to make it explicit that those could be permissible. The other aspect is we currently limit accessory structures, garages, and workshops to no more than 1,000 square feet. And so again, that was to make this consistent with the scale of structures we may find in a residential area. And so those were really the two primary elements that were considered in that section. Under hours of operation, operation of market and community gardens shall be limited to sunrise or 7 a.m. local time, whichever is earlier, and must end at sunset or 9 p.m. local time, whichever is later. An operation shall be defined as people engaged in the operation of the use present upon the site. B, where permitted retail sales shall be limited to hours of 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. local time. And C, the use of motorized equipment shall be limited to 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. local time. And under D, the pickup of produce by those who have purchased shares, such as in a community support or agriculture, shall be permitted during daylight hours and shall not be considered retail sales. And so again, when we're looking at this type of activity in an area that has residential uses around it, this is intended to try to help mitigate any potential conflict of use or late hours of activities.
Bill, did you guys have any discussion on, you back to your use of motorized equipment from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m.? Did you have any discussion about on weekends?
We did not. The current noise ordinance runs from 7 to 10, and so they looked at just the 7 to 9 time frame, but there was no limitation right now. There is a little bit coming up about mechanized equipment and scale of equipment to be used, but there wasn't a discussion about limiting that on weekend hours.
But, wait, are you thinking 7 a.m. on a Saturday is a little early, or what?
I'm thinking 7 a.m. on Sunday might be too early for some folks, not those of us who get up at 6, but there's some folks that are trying to sleep in on weekends.
There are.
Mow their lawns.
There you
7
have.
o'clock, they better not be.
Well, it's
Neighbors
ille-
will be happy with them.
It's legal.
It's loud.
As we looked at
Said the lady that lives in her townhouse.
As we looked at lighting, item number 3, under exterior lighting use shall be limited and shall not result in light trespass or glare upon adjacent residential uses. And item 4, looking at the use of machinery, the use of motorized equipment and machinery shall be limited to typical residential scale equipment, except that larger equipment may be used on an infrequent basis during spring and fall preparation activities. And again, it's trying to make the use more consistent in these lower intensity residential areas with the type of equipment and activities you would see associated with a garden that's accessory to a single-family residence. Item number 5, under general nuisance prohibition, the operation of a market and community garden shall be conducted in a manner so as to limit dust, noise, drainage, overspray of chemicals or smells that would constitute a public nuisance. Item number 6, under signage advertising and/or identifying a permitted market or community garden, use shall be allowed as permitted within the city sign code, just making a reference. Under 7, the keeping of animals, again, may be allowed as permitted per the animal regulations of the city code. Number 8, on off-street parking, in order to preserve residential character of neighborhoods, no off-street parking shall be required for market and community gardens, and any off-street parking provided shall be limited in nature and shall not be fully improved or paved. Again, looking at seasonal and temporary type parking areas in order to minimize the potential, maintain, I guess, the residential character of the neighborhood.